This is part one of a three-part narrated PowerPoint on learning. Hi everybody, welcome to our narrated PowerPoint on learning. I just want to apologize ahead of time for any interesting sounds you may be hearing in the background. Chickens, goats, horses, dogs, all kinds of things. I have a very busy household, so I am oftentimes recording these narrations while I'm outside on my back porch. So I hope you enjoy the following PowerPoint. Let's start off by giving ourselves a simple definition of what learning is. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior brought about by experience. That is the definition that we're going to go with for this PowerPoint. We're going to take a look at a few different types of learning: habituation, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, cognitive learning, including latent learning and observational learning. The first type of learning we're going to talk about is called habituation. Habituation is a pattern of decreased response to an unchanging stimulus. Habituation has been used a great deal in helping us to learn what babies can do. Babies, when they're very small, can't really do much. They can just kind of lay there and look at stuff. Habituation has allowed us to be able to measure what things babies can do. For example, we've learned that babies can distinguish between different colors, different shapes. A small baby can even tell the difference between, say, 6 and 4 different items being presented. So habituation has been a very important tool to show us what babies have learned. An example of habituation, a pretty simple one that I've prepared for this slide, is say we show a baby a blue square on a computer screen. So we have the baby laying there, they're looking at the blue square, they look at the square several times, and then pretty soon they quit staring at it. They will actively turn their head away from the screen and not look at the blue square. At that point, we'll say the baby has become habituated to the stimulus of the blue square. They've gotten bored of it. So next, we show the baby a green triangle. The green triangle, once again, captures that baby's attention. The baby, again, is interested and looks at the screen, at the green triangle. And when this occurs, we say dishabituation has occurred. So the baby is attending to the novel stimulus. So we show the baby the green triangle several times. Pretty soon the baby is just turning its head away. It won't even look towards the triangle at all. Next, we show the baby a red circle. Once we show the baby the red circle, once again, the baby becomes interested or dishabituated and starts to respond to the novel stimuli. If you continue to show the red circle, once again, the baby will become habituated to the red circle and will look away. On the bottom here, there's a link. It says habituation video. It is a really nice little video that just gives a good explanation of habituation. Now we're going to take a look at another type of learning called classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is a type of associative learning where one thing becomes associated with another thing. Our key player for classical conditioning is Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who was interested in studying digestion. He was using dogs and collecting their salivation at the presentation of a food powder. So basically, he was looking at the first part of the digestion process, which is when a dog will salivate, and then he was collecting that to measure how those secretions would affect digestion in the stomach. When he was in his lab one day, he discovered that the dogs were starting to salivate even though no food powder was present. What he discovered was that the dogs started to salivate at just the sound of the researchers who brought the food. they would listen for their footsteps and they would start salivating. Pavlov thought this was a very interesting phenomenon since this was occurring without the food being present. He termed this to be psychic secretions because the dogs were using their psyche basically in order to think this through and make an association between the footsteps and those sounds that were going to eventually lead to getting some food. So Pavlov decided to go ahead and do some research on this topic to find out what's going on with these psychic secretions. Let's talk about some principles of classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is an associative type of learning where one thing becomes associated with another thing. Classical conditioning has to do with reflexive or involuntary behaviors. For example, when food powder is presented to Pavlov's dogs, they started to drool. The drooling or salivation was an involuntary response or a reflexive response after being presented with the food powder. So once again, you would have the food powder being presented, the dog would start salivating, and that salivating is reflexive or involuntary. Here are some basic terms that we will need to be familiar with to understand classical conditioning. The first one is neutral stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. We will be defining these terms on the next slides. We're going to define these terms, and then later on we're going to take a look at these terms again and relate them to Pavlov's experiments. Neutral stimulus, a stimulus that before conditioning does not naturally bring about the response of interest. Unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus that naturally brings about a particular response without having been learned. That would be the food powder. Unconditioned response, a response that is natural and needs no training. That would be drooling. So at least two of these terms we can talk about a little bit right now. The unconditioned stimulus is the presentation of the food powder. The food powder will naturally make a dog salivate. So it would be an unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response is a response that is natural and needs no training. When you give a dog some food, it's going to naturally start salivating. So it's a natural response, it's reflexive, and does not have to be learned. So these three terms are associated with not having any learning occur. The next two terms we're going to talk about relate to after some learning has occurred. The first one is conditioned stimulus, a once neutral stimulus that has been paired with an unconditioned stimulus. It brings about a response formerly caused only by the unconditioned stimulus. The second one is conditioned response, a response that, after conditioning, follows a previously neutral stimulus. Now, these terms can be very confusing right now before we link them to the research. However, after we go through Pavlov's experiment, they should make much more sense to you. So now let's take a look at one of Pavlov's experiments. On the screen, there are several images. The first one is showing a bell and a dog looking at the bell. This is representing the neutral stimulus. The bell is the neutral stimulus. If I ring the bell, the dog would probably look at the bell and prick up his ears, but he would not start salivating. So this neutral stimulus is not bringing forth the response that I am interested in, which is salivation. So it is a neutral stimulus. The next image shows a dish of food and a dog looking at it, salivating. This is representing the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, and the unconditioned response, which is the salivation. So our unconditioned stimulus, the food, automatically causes the reflexive response of the dog salivating. That salivating, which is an unconditioned response. So it is a reflexive response that does not require learning. Next, we're going to move on to the conditioning stage. So the next image shows a bell, the meat powder, and a dog looking towards the bell and the meat powder. So in the conditioning phase, or the acquisition phase of the training, Pavlov would ring the bell, and then the meat would be presented to the dog, and then the dog starts to drool. So you ring the bell, give the food, dog drools. Ring the bell, give the food, dog drools. Ring the bell, give the food, dog salivates. So what's happening here is the ringing of the bell. It starts off as the neutral stimulus. Then the neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, which is the meat or the food. The pairing of these two is causing salivation in the dog. So we have our neutral stimulus, sound of the bell, paired with the unconditioned stimulus, and our dog is salivating. After several pairings of ring the bell, give the food, dog salivates. Ring the bell, give the food, dog salivates. Pretty soon the dog makes an association. He associates the bell with receiving food. So now, after conditioning, the last image is showing a dog looking at the bell and salivating. Because now, if I ring the bell, the dog will start salivating. My neutral stimulus is no longer neutral. That bell has turned into a conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus of ringing the bell is going to generate a conditioned response of salivating. So after learning has occurred and these pairings have been done, our bell changes from the neutral stimulus to the conditioned stimulus, and our salivation, which is a reflexive response, is now occurring at the sound of the bell, which is a learned response, so that is our conditioned response. Let's take another look at the terminology now that we've reviewed one of Pavlov's experiments. Our neutral stimulus would be the bell before the conditioning or learning. It does not elicit the response of drooling or salivating. The unconditioned stimulus, which in this experiment would be the food powder, something that naturally elicited a reflexive response. The unconditioned response was the salivating in response to the food powder. It was the reflexive response that occurred when it was presented due to the presentation of the food powder. The conditioned stimulus was the bell after conditioning or learning. So our previously neutral stimulus of the bell had changed and become the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus is going to elicit a response of drooling. That response of drooling or salivating would be called the conditioned response. That is salivating in response to the bell after conditioning with no food present. So the conditioned stimulus, ringing the bell, was causing the dog to salivate, which is the conditioned response, even without any food present. classical conditioning has an impact on human behavior in our everyday lives. For example, if you like to go to McDonald's, In-N-Out, or whatever your favorite place is to go eat, you will probably go into that restaurant, smell the food, and start to salivate in anticipation of your meal. So after a while, you're going to get some pairings that occur. So you will go to the restaurant, and when you go to the restaurant, you're going to see the sign. So, for example, if you love McDonald's, before you ever smell the food, you're going to see the sign. So you might have the pairing of, oh, here's the sign, smell the food, start to drool, see the sign, start to smell the food, and then start to salivate. So, what can happen in this type of situation is that we have an unconditioned stimulus, which would be the smell of the food, and an unconditioned response, which would be starting to drool or salivate in response to the food. Our neutral stimulus would start off being the sign. The sign would start off as a neutral, it would not automatically make us drool to start with. However, after several pairings of seeing the sign and smelling the food, see the sign, smell the food, see the sign, smell the food, see the sign, smell the food, pretty soon we may just see the sign and then start to salivate at the sight of our favorite food sign. So that's just one of the many, many ways that classical conditioning can act in our life. But remember, classical conditioning is working on reflexive or involuntary behaviors. Another example of classical conditioning in humans comes from a study by John Watson and his graduate student Rosalie Rayner. Now, this is the study of little Albert. There is a lot of controversy surrounding this study, and there's some serious ethical issues as well as different interpretations of what the study can mean. However, for our purposes, this study will do a good job of demonstrating some of the concepts of classical conditioning. So, John Watson wanted to know if he could classically condition fear in a human infant. So, what they did is they took a 9-month-old named Little Albert, and he was given a test of batteries to just a battery of tests to see if he was kind of a normal child. According to his papers, this was a normal child, and they just wanted to see if they can condition a fear response. So, what they did is they put little Albert on a table with a little mattress, and they let him start playing with some little animals. So, like a little white rat, a little white bunny, furry things, and the child had no fear of these objects. So, they started off with those furry things being neutral. So, those were all neutral stimuli. Next, they hung a metal bar behind the baby so that when he was facing away from the metal bar, he would be facing the fuzzy animal. So what they did is they would present the rat to the child. When the child went to reach for the rat, they would strike the metal bar with a hammer, creating a very loud noise, which startled the child, creating a fear response, and he would cry and wail. They repeated this several times. What happened next was that as soon as the child was presented with just the rat, the little white rat, the child would start crying and showing a fear response. So they were able to classically condition fear by using this loud noise to create a fear response, which was then associated with the white rat. So in this situation, the neutral stimulus was the white rat. The unconditioned stimulus was the sound, the loud sound, the striking of the bar onto the with a hammer. The unconditioned response was fear. So next, when they paired the loud sound, they presented the white animal, did the loud sound, present the animal, do the loud sound after several pairings. Pretty soon, the rat became the conditioned stimulus and it elicited fear, which was the conditioned response. We know now that this type of conditioning can be important for phobias, post-traumatic stress disorder. We know that fear is something that can be easily conditioned into a human being. Our brains are uniquely designed to process fear. So once we develop a fear, we easily get those fears, which helps us to run away and survive from things. But once we get them, it's hard to get rid of them. The study of little Albert can also help us to better understand two other terms that we need to know, which is stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. Stimulus generalization occurs after a stimulus has been conditioned to produce a particular response. Stimuli that are similar to the original stimulus produce the same response. Stimulus discrimination occurs if two stimuli are sufficiently distinct from one another. Happens such that one evokes a conditioned response, but the other does not. The ability to differentiate between stimuli. So basically, what I'm saying here is that generalization is talking about stimuli that are very similar to the conditioned response. So for little Albert, he was conditioned to fear a little white rat. So now that he's fearful of the little white rat, he may also be fearful of a little white bunny, a little white puppy, anything that is similar to the stimulus that he was initially conditioned to fear. So stimuli that are similar to the original stimulus produce the same response. So that's stimulus generalization. Stimulus discrimination would be, say little Albert is presented with a big brown dog and he's not afraid of it because it is sufficiently different from the little white rat which he was conditioned to fear. So that would be stimulus discrimination because the two stimuli are sufficiently distinct from one another. Our next classical conditioning concept is higher order conditioning. Higher order conditioning is when you link a conditioned stimulus to another stimulus, which will then elicit the conditioned response. So, for example, if I have a cat, a very hungry cat that I need to feed, I open a cupboard that has a little squeak, and then I use a can opener to open the canned food, and then I give the food to the cat. So when we start off with this process, the can opener and the cupboard are our neutral stimuli. Initially, they do not produce any response in the cat. There's no association starting off between those items and food for the cat. The canned food is the unconditioned stimulus. So the food will automatically elicit an unconditioned response of salivation in the cat. Just like with our dog, we gave them the food made them drool, same thing. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pair the can opener with the canned food. So we have can opener, canned food, salivation in the cat. Can opener, canned food, salivation in the cat. So we pair the canned opener and the canned food several times, and then pretty soon our can opener becomes a conditioned stimulus. Just the sound of the can opener alone creates salivation in the cat, even without giving the cat actual food. Next, for higher order conditioning, we're going to pair our squeaky cupboard with the can opener sound. Our can opener is already a conditioned stimulus. So now our cat is making further associations. They're saying, oh, here's the cupboard is being opened, so it's going to be the squeaky cupboard getting opened, and then the can opener, and then the cat's going to already start salivating because they're already salivating at the sound of the can opener. After several pairings, the cat realizes, oh, I'm going to get fed when they open the cupboard. So the squeaky cupboard will become a conditioned stimulus as well. And that squeaky cupboard is going to elicit salivation in the cat. even without the can opener and without the food. So that would be an example of higher order conditioning. A note on the bottom here is that classical conditioning can also be related to very positive experiences. For example, certain songs, music can make you have certain emotions, maybe make you cry, make you happy, make you feel warm and fuzzy. Certain scents can be very strongly linked with memory. So for me, the scent of orange blossoms makes me feel very warm and fuzzy and gives me a feeling of home because when I was young, that was the smell around my home was orange blossoms. Classical conditioning has an impact on our everyday life. For example, let's talk about how classical conditioning works with my morning coffee. So starting off, when we are not used to drinking coffee, and for those of you who don't drink coffee, hearing a coffee machine or smelling coffee does not trigger any type of physiological response. However, those of us that drink coffee are aware that coffee normally has caffeine in it, and caffeine is a stimulant, which leads to higher arousal in our nervous system. So when we drink our coffee, we have a physiological response to that caffeine in the coffee. So here's how classical conditioning works under those conditions. So I drink a cup of coffee and I have a physiological response. So we know that that part is true. We just went through that. Next thing is I'm going to smell coffee and then drink the coffee. And then I have the physiological response. So there are several pairings between smell coffee, drink coffee, smell coffee, drink coffee, smell coffee, drink coffee. And then pretty soon, the smell of the coffee becomes a conditioned stimulus. So now when I just smell the coffee, my body starts preparing to have that caffeine. So I have a physiological response from the smell of the coffee alone. Next, I will look at some higher order conditioning here, where the coffee maker makes some sounds, then I smell the coffee. So now the smell of the coffee, which is now a conditioned stimulus, is going to be paired with the coffee maker sounds. So I hear the sounds of the coffee maker, smell the coffee, and have the physiological response, which is my conditioned response. After several pairings of the coffee maker sounds and the smell, resulting in that physiological response, the coffee maker itself becomes a conditioned stimulus with higher order conditioning. So at this point, the coffee maker sounds alone start triggering my body to have physiological changes in preparation for that caffeine. Classical conditioning also has a role in drug addiction. Drug addiction is a very complicated subject. It is not as straightforward as just classical conditioning. There are a lot of other factors involved. However, classical conditioning does play a role. So here is an example of how classical conditioning can be involved in problems like drug addiction. So initially, before somebody's doing drugs, certain people, drug paraphernalia, places where drugs are done, those start off as neutral stimuli. When we do a drug, we have a physiological response. For example, if I was doing speed, it would be a stimulant and I would have heightened arousal. So you do the drug, you get the physiological response. That's just a involuntary response that occurs. Eventually, what you do is have paraphernalia. You get the paraphernalia out, you do the drug, have the physiological response. So after several pairings of paraphernalia and the drug, paraphernalia, do the drug, paraphernalia, do the drug. Next, then your paraphernalia becomes a conditioned stimulus and your physiological response is your conditioned response. Because at that point, after those pairings, you have been classically conditioned to respond to the paraphernalia. So the paraphernalia itself will start the physiological response to the drug. Higher order conditioning is also involved in drug addiction. For example, we have the neutral stimuli of going to a particular house. So you go to this house, you use the paraphernalia, which is already a conditioned stimulus, and you get the physiological response, which is a conditioned response. After several pairings of going to the house, the neutral stimulus, the paraphernalia, conditioned stimulus, eventually going to the house alone becomes a conditioned stimulus, which causes a physiological response. This higher order conditioning can work in a lot of other ways. Pairings can be made and associations can be made between certain people, places, smells, times of days. Many other associations can be classically conditioned. So this is just one example of how classical conditioning can impact the use of drugs. Two more terms important in classical conditioning are extinction and spontaneous recovery. Extinction occurs when a previously conditioned response decreases in frequency and disappears. So basically, extinction would occur if I keep ringing the bell without giving the dog food. Over a period of time, if I keep ringing the bell, don't give food, ring the bell, don't give food, ring the bell, don't give food, after a while, the ringing of the bell will no longer indicate that food is coming, so the dog will not drool anymore in response to the sound of the bell. So that would be an example of extinction. Spontaneous recovery is a reemergence of an extinguished conditioned response. So once something has gone through extinction, we say that it has been extinguished. So spontaneous recovery occurs after a period of rest and with no further conditioning. So if I were to extinguish one of the responses that we talked about, like the conditioning of the dog with the bell. So if I no longer pair the food with the bell, then the dog will no longer drool. So that's the extinction part. If a period of time goes by where the animal is not exposed to the stimuli of the bell, and then suddenly they are exposed to the bell and the bell rings, the dog will all of a sudden start to drool again. And that is spontaneous recovery. Their response is not normally as intense, but they do have a response. So the dog would drool, just not drool as much. This slide shows a really nice graph of acquisition, extinction, and spontaneous recovery. The first portion of the graph shows a steep line. This is the acquisition period, or the training period, where the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus are presented together in order to get our conditioned response. After these pairings have been done and we have our conditioned stimulus and conditioned response, and we have peak response, and we decide that we want to extinguish this behavior, then we would just go ahead and give the conditioned stimulus alone. So in this case, it would be just presenting the bell alone with no food. As the chart indicates, there is a steep decline. The animal quickly realizes that the bell is no longer indicating that food is going to be coming, and they stop drooling in response to the bell. After a period of time passes where the animal has not been exposed to the stimuli, and then all of a sudden somebody rings the bell, the dogs spontaneously start drooling again. The spontaneous drooling would be considered spontaneous recovery of the conditioned response. They wouldn't drool as much, but they still would have a response. And then the response would then extinguish again. We talked a little bit about how classical conditioning has a role in drug abuse and drug addiction, and this graph can help with that a little bit as well. During the training phase, that is that up phase, that is the acquisition period where the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus are presented. So at this point, the things are being paired, like drug paraphernalia, where the person is doing the drug, and the effects of the drug. Those are all being paired. Then the person might go to rehab. So the rehab portion would be this extinction phase where the person is learning to no longer respond to the cues that would send them to want to do the drugs in the first place. So they get out of rehab, that's that pause period. They've been doing good for a while. All of a sudden, they drive down the street and they go past the street where their drug dealer's house was. This can automatically lead to a form of spontaneous recovery, where all of a sudden their body is craving the drug. They're already physiologically starting to have a response preparing them for taking a drug. And that response would not be quite as high, but they would still have that kind of response. And that is possibly linked to why it is so hard for people and why they relapse so many times before finally getting off of the drugs. Here are some basic rules for classical conditioning. Your neutral stimulus and your unconditioned stimulus must be presented close in time, usually within a few seconds, in order to make an association. The neutral stimulus must come or be presented before the unconditioned stimulus. Multiple pairings between the neutral stimulus and the unconditional stimulus must be made before an association is formed and the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. However, there is one exception to this rule, and we're going to look at that on the next slide. One trial classical conditioning can actually occur when we are talking about food aversion. John Garcia found that some organisms were biologically prepared to quickly learn to avoid foods that smelled or tasted like something that made them sick. So this is learned taste aversion. This association could be made even if the interval between exposure and sickness was as long as 8 hours after just one exposure. What some researchers have done is, for example, to save cheetahs, what they have done is some researchers have laced carcasses of sheep or other livestock that the cheetahs were eating and stealing from people, and they laced them with a substance, lithium chloride, that made them sick and throw up, but that did not harm them. So what would happen is the cheetah will come in, they'll eat one of these carcasses and get very ill, and then avoid eating the sheep or goat or whatever it was that the carcass was from. This is a one trial learning situation where after only one trial, the animals will no longer be predators for that particular animal. And this has helped keep people from shooting the cheetahs. This has also been used in coyotes and other livestock. In humans, we know that we see this in a person that has been food poisoned. For example, say I love shrimp and I go out and I eat shrimp, and several hours later I have terrible food poisoning, I'm throwing up and all of that. It's going to be a long time before I want to eat shrimp again. So the two rules, or a couple of the rules that we talked about before, are violated in this type of learning. First of all, the pairing happens one time. It is a one-time association. I ate the shrimp, I got sick, I don't want shrimp anymore. The illness came a long period after the food was ingested. So that pairing between the tainted food and the time I got sick was very far apart. So in those particular situations, when we're talking about taste aversion or learned taste aversion, a lot of the rules are violated. This is the end of part 1 of our learning PowerPoints. Stay tuned for parts 2 and 3 of these narrated PowerPoints. I'd like to apologize for the many interesting sounds, interruptions, distractions, and such that are on this narrated PowerPoint. And I'll just ask you to hang in there. We're all doing the best that we can, and I hope this part has been useful for your learning. Thanks and have a wonderful afternoon.